in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast. During my assessments, so my 3-1 bike limiter assessment and my ramp test, I do not do these workouts fasted. The reason for this is because I barely or rarely do any fasted workouts. I also cannot measure CO2 with the VO2 Master. So I don't get RER, and then I don't get carbohydrate and fat oxidation from that anyways. And that's really one of the reasons why you would do a fasted, say, bike test or running test, is to determine what your maximal fat oxidation is. But there's also arguments that I could make that doesn't make sense either, because that is not going to be shouldn't be your normal training. You shouldn't be doing that in a fasted state. So I don't fast. I actually intake carbohydrates while I'm doing these tests. And I find that that makes it more indicative, the outcomes, the zones, the VO2 max, those sort of things, makes it more indicative of what I really see on a day-to-day basis when I'm actually training. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, everybody, I am joined by just myself. This is the first of what I'm hoping turns into many solo podcast episodes that I actually record on the Critical Oxygen podcast. It's taken me this long to kind of get the courage to do a solo podcast, so bear with me. I really want to morph the podcast into a little bit more of the solo podcast nature. So this is my first attempt at a solo podcast episode. And today what we're going to be talking about are the results of all the physiological testing that I did over the past week. One of the things that's extremely important to me and was extremely frustrating to me when I first started doing physiological testing almost 10 years ago now was that I would go into a lab, or I was taught, how to do these VO2 max tests and other things like that. And I would do this extremely challenging test and then get a stack of papers and essentially walk out of there with, oh yeah, your numbers are good. Okay, well, what do I actually do with that? And I think I'm not alone. I've talked to other people on the podcast who have had similar experiences, unfortunately, where we get all this amazing data and then we don't know what to do with it. So one of my missions for 2025 is to help teach all of you as listeners how to use this physiological testing in a way that is extremely actionable and more along the lines of practical. So how do we, say you figure out your VO2 max, your second threshold, and your first threshold. Well, if your VO2 max is, 65, your second threshold occurs at 92% of that, which would be incredibly high at this point. But, it's like, well, what do? Do you, try to improve your VO2 max even more? Do you try to push second threshold even higher, even though it may not be able to get much higher at this point? And the answer lies probably somewhere in the realm of it depends. If we're thinking from the perspective of, like a good academic, the answer is it always depends. So it depends on your goals. It depends on where in the season you are. It depends on when you're doing the testing and if you're going to be doing repeat testing as well. And one of the things that I just want to show you everybody for the upcoming year is how I actually am using physiological testing to get the most out of my own, training. One of the things that I really struggle with is time management and injuries. So what I try to do is I try to do the most training I possibly can without getting injured, because as I've said on the podcast time and time again, consistency, specificity, and progression are the three biggest things that you need to focus on in order to continually progress in your fitness journey. whether that's, accomplishing a feat of endurance like an Ironman, an ultra marathon, a marathon, half Ironman. It doesn't matter. You have to be consistent. You have to be specific with what you're doing, and you have to progress the load, the workouts, the training that you're actually doing in order to continually get better. And that's what I want to show you guys. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with physiological testing. So the big thing that I want to do for this episode is start with kind of describing all of the tests that I did throughout the last week. I have a reason for all the tests that I do. I did a lot of them, like I said. I was looking for specific outcomes. And then from those specific outcomes, I actually want to talk about what I'm going to be doing with those findings. Because again, what's the point of collecting all this data if we don't actually talk about how to use it to better, say, optimize or maximize our performance outcomes? Because that's what I'm looking for. I wouldn't be doing all this testing if I didn't think it was useful for getting me, to the finish line healthier, or to the start line healthier, through the finish line faster, and getting there in a more optimal and efficient manner. So the way that this podcast is going to be laid out is I'm going to lay out what tests I did and why, and then what outcomes I was looking for. Then we'll move on to the results of kind of like each of the tests specifically. And within each of those tests, I'm going to talk about, the information that I got and how I'm going to change my upcoming training, if I am going to change my upcoming training. Then what I want to do is, there were tons and tons and tons of really, really awesome listener questions from all of you on my Instagram over the course of the last week. And I want to start to answer those questions. It's not live, but it's on air, just to start to encourage more engagement with the community. So if you're not, part of the Instagram crew that is over at Critical O2, following me there, go and follow me on Instagram, Critical O2, and you'll be able to start asking questions for episodes like this. And it's just a really good way of me engaging with you guys as a community, with you guys as individual listeners, and trying to keep my pulse on, what you guys want to know. Because ultimately, my goal, as I've said in every single introduction, is to, help teach physiological principles for you guys to optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential, or just your fitness in general. So, and I can't do that unless you guys are interacting with me, asking really good questions. And this is my way of, giving back, because I answer those questions normally in stories, and stories are about 1 minute long. But this gives me a little bit more runway to answer all of those questions as well as I possibly can. So without further ado, let's kind of jump into this. TBD on how long this is actually going to take. This could be a very, very long podcast. So use the chapters down below, whether you're on Spotify or YouTube, to skip around to the different explanations and other things like that. I don't expect people to listen to this all the way through, but I hope this is kind of a compendium of knowledge for you guys to start to learn, this is why Phil is doing a 5-minute all-out test. This is why Phil did his treadmill ramp test the way he did. This is why he set up his physiological testing the way he does. So yeah, let's just kind of jump into it. And I want to start by kind of giving a little bit of training context for myself. So for those of you who don't know, I really have been struggling a lot with a few different things. One of them is a torn hip labrum that happened a few years ago at this point, doing a CrossFit workout where, I was kind of doing some kipping things and heavy deadlift at the same time, kind of threw out my back, and at the same time, I think, tweaked the hip, and somehow that just resulted in a torn hip labrum. Me being the stubborn person that I am, I have tried to do every single thing in terms of PT, rehab, strengthening, other things like that to avoid having to get any major surgery, because surgery makes me much more worried than the current, kind of like pain I'm feeling. The pain that I'm feeling is not bad for the most part. I've really worked a lot on mobility, a lot on, just like glute strength. There's this movement pattern sort of warm up that I do called flow rope that has really helped loosen up my back and my hips. And I think that's been a major factor in me not re-injuring, not re-injuring or aggravating the injury. And one of the biggest things that has allowed me to stay consistent is to mitigate the amount of time that I'm actually training. So what I've experienced is that if I switch from cycling to running, and I keep going back and forth, then I have a much better chance of not aggravating that injury. I've been doing and trying to incorporate more strength training to obviously get stronger. But if I do things like deadlift, or if my hip angles get a little bit too compact, then I have a tendency to kind of aggravate the hip. So that's just one major thing that I've really kind of been battling with. And this should just go along with one of my main goals is just to be able to train consistently and stay healthy. Fitness and being a fit individual really helps me in every other aspect of my life, not only just doing the workouts, but, doing my work, as a physiologist better, feeling more energetic throughout the day, being a better partner to my fiance, being a better dog dad and kitten dad, and all of those things. So exercise is a really, really important thing to me. And when it was taken away, after the hip injury and when I was going through my PhD and too stressed out to really exercise, I realized that all of these different things, how it affected me. So first and foremost, staying consistent with my training and staying healthy is the pinnacle of all of this. Now, I've also been fortunate enough to string together, I think, like 12 to 18 weeks of solid training now. And that has gotten me really encouraged to do what is called the Tiger Claw Ascent. And that is a race that is up in Washington. It's like May 10th or something like that. And the race is 2.5 miles with an elevation gain of 2,500 feet. The reason why I have signed up for this now is because I really like shorter distance races. Just mainly because as a time crunched individual, training for anything really longer than that probably requires a little bit too much training volume for A, that my body's ready for, and B, that that my time in my schedule will allow. So having a race that's going to be between 30 and 60 minutes, depending on how slow or how fast I am, really gives me a good target for how much training I can actually do, and then try to maximize, the outcomes of that training within my training plan. So that's the race that I'm racing for. First goal, stay healthy, stay consistent with my training. Second goal, go and knock it out of the park, or at least, for myself, do the best I possibly can for the Tiger Claw Ascent that's in May. It's going to be a race that's the fastest guys go 27 minutes, and then, race times, can extend out to about 90 minutes plus. So my goal, and I don't know exactly where I'm going to fall on that scale, but I think with, what we'll see with the physiological results here today, I should be trending probably closer to the, 50, 45 minute mark. And that's kind of the target I have set in my mind currently based on my current fitness. Now, going forward, as I get closer to the race, I will definitely be doing some practices, some time trials, some simulations of the race. And, then I'll have a much better idea of pacing strategies and potential, pace for that actual race. So those are kind of the two big goals. And then within that, because I'm doing both running and cycling as my training, I also had a goal that this is just kind of random. After doing a few 5-minute tests here and there, I really wanted to get, really want to accomplish 400 watts for 5 minutes. It's something that, it's like, I'm not familiar with, watts per kilo or, like what's a good 5-minute all out time or anything like that. It's just something that's been really close for me for probably the last 6 months. And, my current, PR prior to this last training block was 389 watts. So I'm like pretty close. And I think with the type of training that I was doing, I'm kind of primed, to try to hit that 400 watts. And that's just kind of like an ego number that I want to hit. So those are really the three goals that I kind of have, within at least my training. And then, another thing that kind of, has always been, I think, kind of holding me back is just like other injury and, potentially not eating enough. Without, kind of diving too much, and there will be another podcast episode on this later on, but, during my cross-country days, I started to misconnect this idea that the lighter you are, the faster you are, because I had success losing, a decent amount of weight during wrestling season and other things like that then resulted in my running times being significantly faster than they had been in the past. However, that undereating, that chronic undereating, really led to a lot of injury, broken feet, Achilles injuries, plantar fasciitis, other things like that. And so another one of my kind of like sub goals is just to make sure I'm eating enough. And again, this goes back to goal number 1, staying healthy, being consistent, and feeling good about, the training that I'm actually doing. So I think that kind of lays the major groundwork for the type of testing, that I was going to be doing. And one thing that I am going to try today is I'm going to try to share my screen and be able to walk you guys through just different visuals. It's very simple. I have like Excel sheets and other things like that, just to kind of give people an indication of like what's going on. So if you're on Spotify, this will be the first video podcast that I actually release. And if you're on YouTube, it'll be the same sort of thing, but this time you can actually see the things that I'm sharing. And I think this will be helpful in terms of, data and other things like that. So yeah, without further ado, let's just walk through my initial training week or assessment week, as it were. So this is just an Excel sheet, that I guess it's not even Excel, it's a Google sheet that I use. And this is the schedule that I have for my testing. Monday, I do a 5-minute all-out bike test. The purpose of this is just to track 5-minute cycling performance over time. Something that I identified really early on in my testing and like from my testing is that I needed to develop VO2 Max. Because by developing VO2 Max, I would essentially increase the height of my house. And by increasing the height of my house, early on in the season, before I actually start to do, more race specific training for that 30 to 60 minute, sort of like threshold race that I'm doing. If I raise my VO2 max really, really high or as high as I can possibly get it, then once I go to try to make changes and make adaptations to my second threshold, I'll have a lot more room or runway for improvement. So that was one of the major things that I wanted to do is I wanted to track my 5-minute all-out performance on the bike with the idea that I was going to try to hit 400 plus watts. And it would also give me a performance marker of Am I progressing, with my cycling or not? And the good thing about the type of training that I do, which is very consistent, I keep my training weeks almost the exact same every single week for an entire block. And by doing so, I can actually track my performance over time. So I know pretty well as I am going through my training that I am actually performing better. And the 5-minute all-out test is just a controlled way of me knowing, you actually were able to improve your 5-minute test or not. And one of the outcome goals for that is just measuring VO2 max with the VO2 master. And you'll see in just a little bit, my VO2 max, especially during the 5-minute all-out test, has definitely gone up, which is really encouraging. Then Tuesday, so another thing I will say is that something that I really like to do is I like to do my tests earlier in the week when I'm fresh, accumulate a little bit of fatigue, and then I like to go into the latter half of the week doing my, zoning sort of style tests. I think this is much more indicative of how most training is going to be. For example, I don't like having 2 days off and then going in and doing a ramp test or a, like some sort of incremental bike test to determine zones, because I think that overestimates your capabilities. And then it can be really discouraging to be training and be like, oh my gosh, like according to, my ideal physiological training or testing day, this is my zone. My zone 2 is at 230 watts, and my second threshold is somewhere around like 320 watts. When in all actuality, when you are training, it's actually closer probably to 200 and maybe 280, for example. So it gives me a little bit more confidence that like on any given day, I'm actually hitting something that's representative of what I'm feeling during training, rather than this ideal number that is happening only once and very, very, very unlikely. So that's kind of why I do performance in the beginning and then more assessments and stuff like that towards the end of the week. So what do I do Tuesday? So Tuesday, after having done my 5-minute all-out bike test and then taking the rest of the day easy, I wake up in the morning, fasted state, and I do my resting metabolism test, or RMR. And the reason why I do this is I need to determine how many calories to consume per day. Like I said, I'm really bad at actually knowing and consuming the amount of energy that I need throughout the day. Especially, I'm a pretty anxious individual. I'm moving around a lot. I exercise, and I'm fairly inefficient with the movements and exercise economy that I have. So I actually burn more calories than other people during a similar movement. So I really struggle with eating enough calories throughout the day. So I do an RMR to double check how many calories I need to eat to maintain or gain weight. This allows me to help eat enough protein throughout the week. I also track my calories with an app called Macro Factor, just because, again, if I know how many calories I'm supposed to eat, I have to track it in order to know if I'm actually hitting those targets. So protein is like the number one priority. And I do about 1 gram per pound of body weight per day. Then I try to eat enough carbs to fuel my performance. So ultimately, I think that comes down to like 50 to 70% of my calories are coming from carbs, and we'll break that down in just a little bit. And then I fill in the rest with fats. And on top of this, because I am monitoring or trying to eat more than I am really burning, I'm also monitoring blood work. And you guys have probably seen my podcast with Robbie Wade from Rhythm Health. It is a monthly blood tracking company that sends you a kit. You basically put this thing on your arm, click a button, and then you draw blood. And it's essentially a lab grade blood test, but it's at your home, and then you just ship it back to their lab. They analyze it and they give you, all the data from, your cholesterol levels to stress hormones to glucose levels to testosterone, vitamin D. The list goes on, but I've really been encouraged by it, and it's really helped me get a deeper sense of what is actually going on underneath the hood of, what's going on in my blood, right? A lot of the times when we are healthy individuals, going into the doctor and getting a blood test is few and far between, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year if you're lucky. And, having the ability to do monthly blood work has really been an eye opener. Has really been an eye opener for me. So there's actually an individual that I'm going to get on the podcast, and we're going to talk all about, the risks of under eating, how that can actually be presented in blood work, and then what you can do about it. Because again, I'm coming from the perspective that I don't do a good job of eating enough food. I know that's probably not the majority of the population in the US, but I think for endurance athletes especially, and people who are, really hard charging individuals just trying to get the most out of, their fitness and life and other things like that, there is a propensity for us to undereat. And that's just one of the reasons why I do monitor my blood work. I also have, a family history of hypercholesterolemia, which can lead to calcium buildup and other things like that, like in the arteries, and, then ultimately lead to heart attacks. So I'm trying to balance all of this sort of stuff with, high performance, but also maximizing my health. So if you haven't seen the videos that I've been releasing with my discussions about my blood work with Robbie Wade, who's the CEO of Rhythm Health, go over to YouTube, and maybe I will release those as mini podcast episodes on the podcast as well, because him and my conversations are really, it really, you start to think about blood work differently when you're getting it every month. For example, one of the biggest things that I learned from the first test that I did was my vitamin D was super low and my testosterone was super low. And, so I started supplementing with vitamin D over the course of a month. And I was also trying to get a little bit better sleep in order to raise my testosterone. At this point, I've tripled my testosterone because I've been eating more, taking more vitamin D, and sleeping better. And I wouldn't have ever known that or connected the dots to that had I not actually done monthly blood tests. So if you guys are interested in learning more about, like the blood test or anything like that, I have a link down in the description talking all about Rhythm Health. Click on that. You'll get, I think, like $10 off your first order. And I overall, I just really like the company, and I've had a really, really good experience with them so far. And to the point where it's like, well, now that I'm doing monthly blood tests, I don't know what I'm going to do if I go away from something like this. So it's been very, very useful for me, but that's the next test that I did. So I did an RMR on Tuesday, followed by a blood test after I get hydrated enough. Then after I do my fasted stuff, so the RMR and the blood test, I fuel up, have a protein or have like a smoothie. Actually, I have 2 smoothies, and then I have a little bit of pre-workout, get a little bit hydrated, and then I do my hill test. So the hill test is a run up this hill in my backyard. It's 0.3 miles, something along those lines, and like 350 feet of elevation gain. So it's pretty steep. And this is used to track my running performance. This hill is similar to the percent grade that the hill will be for the race that I'm actually doing. And what it allows me to do is track my running hill performance. I have this thing called progression here. And this is as I get closer to the race, what I want to do is get more and more sport specific. So I will move away from the short hill and try to find a longer hill that is closer, to the test sort of environment and those sort of things. A little bit more, like threshold tempo, maybe takes me, like as opposed to 4 minutes, it takes me, like 9 to 20 minutes. I can also switch this to my treadmill that now has some pretty crazy percentages in terms of elevation. It goes up to 40% incline. But at the end of the day, the insights that I'm looking for here is, am I progressing in my top end running? One of the workouts that I do very, very consistently, or actually literally every week, is on Mondays, I go and I do a VO2 Max hill workout up this hill. I've slowly worked my way from 2 repetitions, somewhere around like 5 minutes and 30 seconds, to I'm up to 4 repetitions as of the recording of this podcast, all under or right at 5 minutes. So I've gotten much, much more fit, and my ability to actually run up this hill has gone up. But I also just kind of like, just like the one-off, just like, bust your ass going up the hill and see what you can get. And my big goal is to go sub 4. And we'll see, I'm actually pretty close to that, given the last workout or the last test that I just did. Then on Wednesday, I'm now taking the day off. It just so happened that both Christmas and New Year's, were kind of on, Wednesdays this year. So, just by happenstance, I took the day off and it felt really good. If I were at home, I would do something really, really light if I was going to do anything, but I take Wednesdays off. Then on Thursday, I do a 3-1 bike test. It's also called a limiter assessment, which we'll talk about in much more detail in just a little bit. And what I can do from this is I can determine, just give a little more context here. What it entails is 3 minutes of work with 1 minute of rest, and then increasing the intensity as we go up. So what it allows me to do is it allows me to determine my zones and my limiter for cycling. The goal here, or the progression, is just continue to increase test time. So the first time I did it, I think I got up to 340 watts or 350 watts. This last time, my goal was to get to 360, which I did. And I will try, to get to, say 380 next time. So that is just a way of me tracking my performance from a much longer, sort of style test compared to the 5-minute all-out bike. The insights that I gained from this is, what are my training zones and how are they shifting in response to training? This is really important because your training zones do change in response to the training that you're actually doing. Surprise, surprise. Or at least they should be if you're actually implementing proper training stress and training adaptations. So that's one of the things. It also allows me to track my limiter, which I said we'll go into a little bit more, but that is something that I use to actually tweak the style or the workouts that I actually do. So for example, if I identify having a pulmonary limitation, then what I can do during my VO2 Max bike intervals is I can do a hard start interval where I go really, really hard for 30 to 90 seconds. And then I, kind of reduce the intensity, and I'm breathing really, really hard. So the focus of that is to actually focus on breathing deeply and breathing hard at the same time, and rapidly. So it's all that coordination, because if you have a pulmonary limitation, that is going to then be limiting, in at least, from this idea that it's going to be limiting your ability to actually perform. And my goal right now is to make it over the 400 watt stage. It's something that I know is probably, I know I'm capable of doing it with a 5-minute all out test that I do. But after, 45 minutes to an hour of cycling on the bike and doing, 320, then 340, then 360 watts, it gets a little dicey and a little tiresome to be on the bike for that long. So that is one of the things, especially as I get closer to the race, I'm going to want to see that number come up. So then the final test that I do is a ramp test on the treadmill that I just got. I'm like bragging about a treadmill. I sound like an old man, but I am actually super excited about it. It's, it only goes up to 12 miles per hour, which isn't like the fastest, but I don't need that. It goes up to 40% grade though, which is like industry. That's like the highest in the industry without spending, like tens of thousands of dollars on a really, really specialized treadmill. So I actually, the first time I did this ramp test was, this last testing session or this last, testing week. And what it's good for is determining zones for running, especially VO2 Max as well, because I do not wear the VO2 Master during the hill test. There's just too many moving parts, and it's an expensive piece of equipment that, if I fell or something and damage to the device, I would be very upset. So it's a controlled environment to determine zones for running and my VO2 Max. The goal or the progression here is to continue to increase test time. Last time I got up to 24% grade at 5 miles an hour. And my goal is to really kind of make it to the 30% stage, and have that be my VO2 max. I would be happier, obviously, if it went higher, but right now making it to the 30% would be really, really cool. So that's the testing week. Is I start out with the performance in the beginning of the week, and then I end with more of the assessments towards the end of the week. During my assessments, so my 3-1 bike limiter assessment and my ramp test, I do not do these workouts fasted. The reason for this is because I barely or rarely do any fasted workouts. I also cannot measure CO2 with the VO2 Master. So I don't get RER, and then I don't get carbohydrate and fat oxidation from that anyways. And that's really one of the reasons why you would do a fasted, say, bike test or running test, is to determine what your maximal fat oxidation is. But there's also arguments that I could make that doesn't make sense either, because that is not going to be shouldn't be your normal training. You shouldn't be doing that in a fasted state. So I don't fast. I actually intake carbohydrates while I'm doing these tests. And I find that that makes it more indicative, the outcomes, the zones, the VO2 max, those sort of things, makes it more indicative of what I really see on a day-to-day basis when I'm actually training. So, I know there's justifications for why you would want to do a fasted test versus non-fasted test. My justification is consuming carbohydrates similar to how I would train is more important to me and more indicative of how I train as well, compared to, getting max fat oxidation or something like that, which I can't even measure. So, so that's my testing week. Now what I want to do is let's actually walk through each test and what each test result actually was. So let me pop up my notes or actually it's just a summary, and I'll share my screen again, just to show you guys, kind of the way that I actually lay out and try to distill all of the information. Because I think a lot of the times, we get a lot of data, and it's like, well, what the heck do we actually do with it? So let me show you what the actual results page, summary page of my spreadsheet looks like. So what I have is, and this is so simplistic, so forgive me if it's over the top too simplistic, but I have my 5-minute cycling test, and then I just record the outcomes that I want for each time I do the test. So on August 19th, this is before I actually went to Kona, I believe. It was definitely before I went to Kona, but it might have even been before I went to Europe. I did it was supposed to be a 5-minute all out test. It turned to a 3-minute all out test. because I was feeling like crap that day. I distinctly remember this. And I only did the 5-minute test at that point, just because I hadn't strung together enough consistency and other things like that to really feel confident doing a full week of testing. Now, the first true testing week I did was on November 21st, 2024. And that was like the week of Thanksgiving. And I did my 5-minute all out test. And I think I had people on Instagram, guess, hey, what's my VO2 max? What's my watt max going to be? So the average wattage that I'm going to have, and then what's my max heart rate? And just to recap those results really quickly, VO2 max average for the top 1 minute, I believe, was 76 mils per kilogram per minute. That is a liters per minute of 5.7. Which I was actually really, really happy with. Like that's a pretty big aerobic engine. So I was really happy with that. My power output was 389 watts, and this is indoor on a fan bike with no air blowing on me. And my max heart rate was 176. So conceivably, if I went outside and just like busted my butt for 5 minutes, I could get I could really have, reached a little bit higher of, a power output, but I do all my testing indoors. It's a little bit more controllable. One of the questions that I got was, how do you control the environment? I live in a house that has the same sort of temperature, environment, humidity, those sort of things all year round, because we have air conditioning and heat and those sort of things. So, I don't get too worried or overly worried about, how cold or how warm it is, because it stays pretty consistent over time. So 389 watts though, pretty happy with. Also kind of tickled my, am I going to be able to do, get up to 400? So I recently redid testing. So I redid testing, now a week ago on December 30th. And that was the week of December 30th. And my highest 1 minute average, or my 1 minute high average was 84 mils per kilogram per minute. This equated to a VO2 max in liters per minute of almost 6.5 liters. I was able to hit 400 watts for the entire 5 minutes, and my max heart rate was around 176. So from a difference perspective, I was able to increase my VO2 max by like 10%, from a relative perspective, 13% from an absolute perspective, because I did gain a couple of pounds between 11:21 and 12:30. So the relative value didn't go up quite as much as the absolute value. But what was interesting, right, is that the actual performance gain was only about 3.3%. And this is something that I think is really interesting. We like to try to figure out if there's one variable that's going to be able to predict performance or improvements or in performance or other things like that. And one variable increase does not directly translate to a performance increase of the same magnitude, where, so you have to be really wary of saying, oh, well, my physiology improved by this much, so therefore my performance should improve by this much. That's not the case. There could be inefficiencies in terms of my riding that doesn't translate to, direct increases in power output. For example, I could be generating a little bit more heat. I could just be, not able to translate my chemical energy into mechanical energy on the bike. There's a lot of different factors that could go into this, and the fact that I was only riding this last block 2, maybe 3 times a week. And I think I was on the bike for a maximum of like maybe 2 hours. Also is kind of indicative of, we're not going to see, extreme increases in true performance, but I was stimulating my VO2 max 2 times a week, because my training program was VO2 max workout running on Mondays, VO2 max workout cycling on Tuesdays. So I was really, really hitting my increases in VO2 max really, really hard. But again, it didn't necessarily translate over to increases in cycling performance, even though I did PR by 13 watts, which was, in my opinion, I was extremely, extremely happy with that. And this, kind of just shows that being consistent in your training is really important for performance gains. So that was, kind of a summary of my 5-minute cycling. Let's now answer some questions. Actually, there's just one, no, there was no questions because I didn't pose any questions or anything like that. I do think, just in summary, I use the 5-minute test just as a performance marker. So what does that mean going forward? Well, my VO2 max was improving, and my 5-minute cycling power was improving as well. Now, am I going to totally abandon development of VO2 max? The answer is no. I still have 5 months until my actual race, which again is going to be really focused on threshold. So, and I've been finding that I've been getting improvements to VO2 max. Now, I expect a little bit more diminishing returns for the upcoming, next block. So what I'm doing for this next block is my VO2 max workouts, especially for the bike, are going to be just maybe a little bit longer, and they're going to have slightly more repetitions. Because what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to transition my VO2 max work to more work that looks a little bit more like threshold work. It's not going to look perfectly like threshold work because when you're doing 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, that's very indicative of VO2 max. But by building more and more repetitions in there and then shortening the rest potentially just a little bit, it will start to look like more extended threshold style work. And eventually I will start to get tired and probably fatigue down to second threshold. So the big insight here is, I'm going to do one more month of, pretty specific VO2 max work, trying to develop my VO2 max. And then I'm going to make a little bit more of a hard transition to more of that threshold work. What I'm batting around in my head right now is, do I want to continue to do the 5-minute all out test, or do I want to try to increase the all out test, the time to exhaustion test that I do? Am I going to do 6 minutes? Am I going to maybe work it up to 10 minutes and then keep it there for a few and then try to go up to, 20 minutes because, that's going to be a little bit more indicative of FTP? Am I going to try to do repeat, like 6 minutes hard, rest, 6 minutes hard? I haven't fully decided that yet. For this next block, I am going to try to just do the same 5-minute test and then probably transition into something that might be a little bit longer. But that's still a little bit TBD and up in the air. So now let us walk through my RMR test. So those of you who are unfamiliar with what an RMR test is, it is a resting metabolism test. And essentially it's the easiest test here. You wake up in the morning, you drink some water, no coffee or anything like that. You go, you get your VO2 master nice and calibrated and those sort of things. And then you just sit and relax for 10 to 20 minutes. I do 20 minutes. So I have a 10-minute kind of like, relaxation phase, and then I have a 10-minute record phase. And what that allows me to do is that allows me to determine how many calories I need or how many calories I would burn at rest if I just sat on the couch all day doing nothing. And based on my activity level, how many calories I should be burning per day. So if we actually look at the results here, so we go down to RMR, we can look at, the first time I did the test, calories per day or just actual RMR was 2,136. Calories per day was estimated to be around 3,685. And then from that, what I did is I said, okay, well, protein, number one thing, just to ensure I'm having adequate recovery. Endurance athletes were pretty bad at eating enough protein. So I wanted to hit 1 gram per pound of body weight. That is just what I have found, maybe even a little bit more, to be good in keeping me feeling recovered, making it so like I'm actually like less sore. I can come back on a day-to-day basis and feel like I'm getting better. Then what I do is I decided how many carbohydrates that I wanted to intake. I can't remember exactly what the percentage was, and actually we can figure that out right now. So let's try to figure that out. So 566 times 4, and then divide that by, so it's about, I'm intaking around 61% energy from carbohydrates per day. And that's just another number that I have found that has really worked for me. It is one of those things where I know there's a lot of people out there who, actually feel really good by intaking more fats. Hey, whatever works best for you and allows you to stay consistent and stay healthy. What I really try to do is protein target is like you have to. It's non-negotiable. You have to hit your protein target. If you're not allowing for enough protein to be in your diet, then you are essentially playing a dangerous game of Jenga, where you are trying to build the tallest tower you possibly can, but you're not giving yourself the amino acids, which are the building blocks of your muscle, your mitochondria, the functional enzymes that you need to do all bioenergetics and other things like that. So you're essentially taking, from the bottom of your tower and stacking it on top. So for me, protein is the number one priority. And then from there, the question becomes, well, do you feel better with carbohydrates? Do you feel better with fat? What sort of races are you doing? Are you doing something that is, longer and slower? Okay, well, maybe you can focus a little bit more on fats. Are you doing something that is higher intensity and shorter than carbohydrates? Are you running? Are you cycling? Running requires a lot more carbohydrates compared to cycling because of the weight-bearing nature and just the amount of contraction that you're doing. So ultimately, it kind of comes down to personal preference, but you have to make up the rest of your calories with carbohydrates and with fats. One way or the other, you have to choose. And I choose to go the carbohydrate route. It makes me feel better. I don't feel sluggish. I'm able to actually eat and consume the amount of food that I actually need to in order to, again, stay healthy and stay consistent, which is the number one goal. Performance is under that. I'm also doing higher intensity stuff, focused on, 30 to 60 minute race, which is going to be extremely high in carbohydrate turnover. So overall, I'm teaching my body to deal with more carbohydrates, and it's just what helps me feel better. So then, second test. So test last week, my RMR was down like, 29 calories or something like that. So, negligible changes. My calories per day, again, predicted to be 3,635. So essentially protein stays the same. And then there's just very, very slight changes to carbohydrate target and fat target. This resulted in less than like a 1% change across the board. I wouldn't really expect this to change too much unless I, somehow built an inordinate amount of muscle over the course of 6 weeks. I'm not a strength and hypertrophy athlete, so I wasn't expecting to do that. Like I said, I have gained a little bit of weight, and I do think it's probably, to some extent, a little bit of muscle, maybe a little bit of adipose tissue. But overall, because my performance, my, just overall well-being and other things like that, I am not concerned about the excess weight that I'm, that I potentially am putting on. I also, again, do not want to be under consuming food, because I think, for like, if you are too far on that side for too long, then you can run into a lot of pretty crazy issues. And I don't want to be there, but my blood work actually still kind of indicates that I might still be under consuming to some extent. So I'm working through that. I'm not ready to talk about it quite yet, just because I don't have a very well fleshed out idea and direction for those sort of things. But as far as the RMR goes, the direction that I am going to take is just continue to consume as many or adequate amount of calories throughout the day that allows me to sleep better, feel better, recover better. And from there, hopefully that'll allow me to start to take on more training volume if time permits. Now, there was a question here from an individual, Dr. Hibblebauer, on Instagram, who asked, how can you know how many calories you are burning without CO2? This is a very valid question. In the informational portion of things from VO2 Master, what they say is that they assume that your RER is 0.85. And by doing that, what you can do is you can still calculate how many calories are being burned based on the amount of oxygen you're consuming. And the amount of calories that you're burning, if you just assume, that your RER is 0.85 versus if you actually measure it, and then if you use CO2 and O2, is fairly negligible. And what I will say though is that if from a statistical point of view, it has been shown to be significant. I talked to Shalea Kipp about this, all about economy and calories and other things like that. And she was saying that there absolutely is a difference. But what I will say is that for practical purposes, the difference, say for example, my calories per day was 3,600 versus 3,700. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use that number as an estimate for how many calories I'm supposed to be intaking per day. Then on top of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh myself, track my food first and foremost, and then weigh myself and track my weight over time. By doing this, what you allow yourself to do is say, well, I have been consuming this 3,635 calories per day, and I have a tendency to gain a little bit of weight. Okay, well now you can dial it back maybe a little bit. So what I always recommend when I'm doing testing, when I'm doing anything like that, is use the numbers as an estimate and a starting point. If you're using those as an estimate and a starting point, then what you can do is you can measure and track how things are changing, say on a day-to-day basis, weekly basis, something like that. And then you make adjustments accordingly. So this is, pretty important for, like measuring your calories or tracking your calories, for example, because if you just said, okay, well, 36, 35 is my target calories, that's what I have to hit. And then you tried to do that every single day and you were just, you gained, like 5 pounds or something along those lines, then, or you continually gained weight, then maybe that 3,600 calories was an overestimation for your current goals. So that's what I like to do. I like to say, okay, well, how many calories do I need to intake? Am I actually hitting that goal? And, then from there, how is my weight changing? And not just like a fluctuation day to day, because if you actually track weight day to day, it can fluctuate quite a bit based on water intake, salt intake, carbohydrate intake, those sort of things. But if you track trends over time, then seeing where, that weight is going, is it continually going up? Is it staying flat or is it going down? That will give you an idea of how to kind of adjust and change course if you're not meeting the, say like the body composition goals or the weight goals that you want to hit. All right. So that was the RMR. Now let's go into the hill test. The hill test is pretty straightforward. We have the time to run up the hill, and then we have the max heart rate measured while running up the hill. And it really is a straightforward test. There's nothing crazy about it or anything like that. Very similar to the 5-minute all-out test. It's a marker of, well, how am I doing? Am I able to run up hills faster or not? My first test that I did, I hit 4:37, and I was like, man, that is going to be the fastest time I ever hit because it was super hard. That hill is so steep. And I was just like, there is no way I'm ever going to get faster doing that. Then I started my next training block where I was doing 3 repetitions up the hill during the VO2 Max workouts on Mondays. And in the middle of one, I felt actually really, really good one day. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to see how far up this hill I can actually run, because most of the time I would run to kind of like a first checkpoint and then I'd power hike the rest of the way. And I was starting to feel like I could probably run even higher up the hill. So I tried that, and this was like halfway through this training block, and I hit 423, and it was the first rep of 3 reps. So I hit 423, then I hit 440, then I hit, like 450 or something like that. Not the best splits, for a workout, but I hit 423. So I was like, oh my gosh, I just PR'd by 14 seconds. And that was like during a workout when I didn't even really feel that good. So then coming back and, doing my actual test, the 1 rep up the hill as hard as I could, I knew coming into it that I was feeling really good. I was running really well up the hill, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to try to run as far up this hill as I possibly can until I kind of get tired. Most of the time it's the running that leads to kind of like a VO2 max. And then if I start power hiking, I'm still breathing really hard, but I'm not, like completely gassed and redlining. So I ran as high as I could, power hiked to a place that it kind of gets a little bit more shallow in terms of the grade, and then ran my ass off the rest of the way. And I managed to hit 407. That I was like very, very floored with. 407, I, again, never thought that I was going to even be close to like, say, 4 minutes. So 407 was huge. And now my goal is to hit sub 4, hopefully the next time. Essentially what this means is that, I was able to decrease my time over the course of that training block by like 10%. So kind of commensurate to that increase in VO2 max that we were looking at earlier with the 5-minute test. My max heart rate did not change. If anything, it might have gone down maybe just a little bit, but it can fluctuate based on hydration status, fatigue, other things like that. So the direction that I'm going to take with this big change in running, speed up the hill is I'm adding 1 more repetition to my VO2 max hill workouts. And what that's going to allow me to do is build up more of that VO2 max sort of style endurance, like just more rep, more time under tension for VO2 max reps. Like I said earlier, the first workout that I did, every rep was under or very, very close to 5 minutes. And it was a really gnarly day because I had to move, I think like 40 or 50 100-pound bales of hay before I went out to do the VO2 max workout. So I was feeling pretty tired, but I was still able to manage sub 5. And going from 3 reps to 4 reps, it might not seem like much. Obviously it's like a 25% increase, but it felt way worse on top of the fatigue that I already had built up from the power cleans that I was doing, moving those 100-pound bales of hay. So this is just an opportunity again for me to continue to expand my VO2 max, get it higher for running, and then build kind of like a little bit more of like a ceiling to be able to increase my second threshold when I start to actually move more towards second threshold style work. And one of the things that's going to be challenging is that the hill in my backyard is a set height, a set distance, and running up and down that, I can't generally like the rest periods. It's tough running down it and getting rest. So going forward, when I do actually try to start and switch those workouts to more threshold style, it'll be a little bit slower. I'm still going to build up reps, but it'll be a little bit slower. And then the rest going down will be a little bit faster. So maybe I do a little bit more kind of like jogging down the hill. And that's how I'm going to modulate my threshold workouts when I get to that point in the season. But like I said, I'm still 5 months out. So I still have a little bit of time, to kind of mess with this whole, idea of increasing my VO2 max even more. All right. Questions. Oh, so yes. So there was one question from Health Matters IRE. And the question is why do you need to find max heart rate if you've already done a VO2 max test? And doesn't VO2 max test give you your zones? Yes and yes. I don't need to find max heart rate again, but something that is really interesting is that sometimes performance max heart rate is not the same as test max heart rate. So from there, I'm just interested to see if my max heart rate during, like climbing up that hill is the same as my threshold, or not my threshold test, but my incremental ramp tests. And if it is, or if it isn't, what's going on. I don't use that to make any zoning decisions or anything like that. I use the results of the controlled test, the ramp test on the treadmill to make those zoning decisions. And a lot of the times too, when I'm doing trail running, I like to use RPE. I use RPE, so rating of perceived exertion on a scale of 1 to 10. And then I cross-check that with the heart rates at my different thresholds in order to actually see, am I working hard enough for the intended outcome for that day? So I don't make any zoning decisions just based off of max heart rate, but I do measure it because I like to get a performance metric and a physiological metric. I also track SMO2 using my Moxy monitors on all of these things. And it's one of those things, again, I'm just collecting more data so that if and when I do get to my, say, VO2 max workouts or like other things like that, if for some reason power output feels off that day, then I can use SMO2 kind of as, a physiological touch point to say, this is too much, or this is not enough, sort of stimulus for the day, or your body isn't even ready for it. So yeah, and I guess this is probably a good point. I probably should have, talked about this earlier, but I use a number of different devices when I am actually doing my physiological testing, and one of the big ones is VO2 Master. It is a face mask based device that measures respiratory variables, so respiratory frequency, minute ventilation, tidal volume, those sort of things. It also measures rates of oxygen consumption, so VO2, which is where we get VO2 max from. And it gives me really whole body measures of, my physiology in real time. Then, because I can't wear the VO2 Master out training and those sort of things, I also wear a heart rate monitor. I use a Polar H10. I believe this one's an H10. Yeah. I really like the Polar H10 just because of its versatility for connecting to, different devices. It can, stream 2 channels at once. So if I collect on my Garmin watch and my iPhone, for example, I can get heart rate to both of those. And it gives me the ability to, it gives me a really easy touch point in terms of data when I do go out running or when I am cycling, because I know where those heart rates are and where they should be, at least the ballpark for them. And then I can adjust speed and power and RPE accordingly. And then arguably probably one of the most important pieces of technology that I wear every single day is a Moxy monitor. There it is. It's a near-infrared spectroscopy device that just goes on your muscle, shines red light into your muscle, and then measures oxygenation. So how much oxygen is underneath that sensor and how it's changing over time. And it tells me how my body, how my muscle specifically is coping with the load that I am placing upon it. And there's some really good podcast episodes, not to toot my own horn, that Dave Shell and I have released talking all about, like the use of Moxy monitor for training and racing and other things like that. I'm also the staff physiologist for Moxy monitor. So just a little bit of heads up, for purposes of, just like admitting where you have potential conflicts of interest. That's what it's called. I work for the company, but I don't work for companies that I don't trust their devices and don't use their devices. So, so for the Moxy monitor, if you want more information, definitely just reach out to me and just say, hey, I need more information on Moxy monitor. But if you go to moxymonitor.com, there's a lot of really good information there. And then Moxy also has a number of free courses that's on Moxy-Academy. And I will put those links in the description below. So if you are interested in learning more, it's completely free. You can go over there. I have a seminar series called Training and Racing with Moxy, where I walk through all the different things that I use Moxy for, and other users of Moxy have used in the past. And it's just one of those things. I wear it on a day-to-day basis just to see how is my physiology coping with the loads that I'm actually placing it under. And it's a lot more granular than heart rate. I'm looking over here because I'm grabbing my heart rate monitor and my Moxy. So whenever I go on a run, go on a ride, I wear a Moxy and a heart rate meter, or a heart rate meter, and a heart rate chest strap. And those are the two things, along with my Garmin watch, that I collect data on. And then if I'm cycling, I collect power data. And if I'm running, I collect, GPS data and other things like that. That's kind of all the technology that I use around testing and other things and those sort of things. And now I think is actually a good time for us to jump into a limiter assessment. This one is probably the most asked about question that people had. So let me start by just answering the question, well, what is a limiter assessment? A limiter assessment is a way of determining, or at least trying to figure out, what is most limiting your endurance performance. That's the most simplistic answer. The way that it works is, if you think about your body as a factory, you're manufacturing cars, and your performance is how fast you get across the finish line or how fast you can get a car manufactured. If you have 3 steps in terms of, it's oxygen, really the oxygen cascade. But in terms of performance, you have 3 steps. Say you have, door installation, window installation, and engine installation. And you have, a nice linear assembly line. If you do your training to improve your door installation, that first step, but your rate limiting step within your assembly line is really engine installation, then it does not matter how well you can install doors, because you will have a lot of doors being installed, but your rate limiting step is still your engine installation. So a limiter assessment, what we're trying to do is we are trying to identify what step within your performance process is most rate limiting. And we're doing it from an oxygen perspective. So when so the hypothesis is that whatever is limiting oxygen or gas exchange the most is your rate limiting step. So that could be your pulmonary system, because your pulmonary system brings oxygen in. Then you transfer that oxygen to your cardiovascular system. So your heart pumps the blood. So you could have a cardiovascular limitation, or your muscle, which is ultimately where that oxygen gets used. So you could have a muscular limitation as well. On the flip side of things, your muscle produces CO2 as a byproduct of bioenergetic breakdown, or just bioenergetics. Also produces hydrogens, or protons, if we want to be a little bit more correct here, produces protons that need to be buffered. Because if you do not buffer the protons that are accumulating within your muscle, eventually those protons can build up and they can inhibit force production. And that's called fatigue. So you have metabolites, CO2, protons that are being produced from your muscle. And ultimately your lungs are what kind of breathe off that CO2. And without going into, too far of detail in terms of, like the bicarbonate buffering system and other buffering systems that we have, ultimately your lungs can be limiting, by the fact that they can either not intake enough oxygen, which that normally doesn't happen, or you can't blow off and exchange enough CO2. Your cardiovascular system could be limiting your performance by not being able to transport enough oxygen to the working muscle. Or your muscles could be limiting your performance because they simply can't extract enough oxygen in order to make enough ATP for contraction to continue. So what this limiter assessment does is it takes you through a series of harder and harder exercise intensities. I start at 60 watts and I do that for 3 minutes. That's why it's called a 3-1 test. So 3 minutes hard or 3 minutes working, 60 watts starting, 1 minute rest. That 1 minute rest is complete rest. So you rest with your foot up in the same position, or if you're on a treadmill, you straddle the treadmill, no movement for 1 minute. You slowly increase that exercise intensity, so 20 watts every step until failure. And what we're doing by introducing a 1 minute rest is that, and I should also say, we're wearing a Moxy monitor, a heart rate meter. I don't know why I keep calling it a heart rate meter, a heart rate monitor, and our metabolic device like a VO2 Master or, whatever metabolic device you have. And then from there, we're measuring both exercise onset kinetics of local muscle oxygenation, heart rate response, oxygen consumption, and changes to respiratory variables, and recovery kinetics of those as well. So in order to actually determine what your limiter is, there's a series of kind of steps that you would take. And I think it would be better to explain this in a different video. Actually, no, I'll just explain it now. So what I'm going to do is I will share a document that was created by the guys at Moxy Monitor. And in particular, it was a group, pretty early on in Moxy Monitor. It's called the 515 Interpretation Tool. This is completely free if you go to the Moxy Academy. And if you go to the Moxy Academy, you go to the Training Integration Guide. It's a free course, and you scroll all the way down. You can download this Excel macro sheet. And essentially, what you are going to do, if I can share this, and I think I can, is you are going to fill out, your general athlete information, where the Moxy was collected, what working muscle. If you do a low priority muscle, you can also fill that out. And then if you're wearing a heart rate strap or more, or if you're wearing a heart rate monitor or not. From there, you're going to look at your SMO2 data and you're going to record your resting SMO2, which mine was 63. So what I do is I pop up my screenshots or, training peaks or whatever I collected, my 3-1 or my limiter assessment data, and I have that in a separate screen. And then I just look at what the data actually is. So my resting SMO2 was 63. At the end of the test, my SMO2 got down to 20 or 30%, or between 20 and 30%. I believe it was 25. Then it asks you, what best describes the trends in resting SMO2 in the later part of the assessment. And this is resting SMO2. And this is a big one. If your resting SMO2 is going down, then that could indicate to us that you have an inability to reoxygenate. If you have an inability to reoxygenate, your cardiovascular system might be struggling to keep up with the amount of oxygen that's being demanded. So you would answer that. And all of these have, kind of just general drop down, menus. So steady, clear increase, clear decrease, and then, slight increase and decrease as well. And what you're doing is you're just trying to answer to the best of your ability based on the data you're looking at. What does this data actually look like? For me, it's steady. My resting SMO2 is like, for the 1 minute rest, will go up to about 83% the entire time and just stay that way. Now, another good question, to then look at is, well, what best describes the trend in working SMO2 across values? So mine continually drops. I'm able to use more and more and more oxygen throughout the entire test, where you might find an individual who they don't decrease their SMO2, say below like 50%, and then it just kind of flatlines after that. If that is the case, then that could indicate that they have a muscular limitation, or something could be going on where if they can't, continue to decrease their SMO2, you might actually be measuring in a non-limiting muscle. That is just something that is important to note, and we can actually kind of mess around with it. If for example, we said, it was steady, towards the end. Let's see how that changes. It doesn't really change stuff too much. But the point is that, because you're answering all of these questions, you're able to get a good idea of what sort of limitation you have. And then there's always this question about what happens between trend or within intervals. Because we are doing a 3-1 test and we are not repeating the same load step twice, I always just stay steady here. It doesn't have that much effect on the actual outcomes, but it is something that you'll have to answer at some point. So just put steady for that. Then you answer some questions about total hemoglobin. Again, the resting values and the trends within the working THB are really important, because if total hemoglobin is going up during rest, then that's most likely indicative that you're able to deliver enough blood to the working muscle. Whereas if total hemoglobin is going up during your working intervals, that could be indicative. And I say could be because we don't have the ability to truly measure this. It could be an indicative of increases to CO2, which is a very potent vasodilatory component, which then could lead to more blood being in the working muscle. And that is indicative of a pulmonary limitation, your inability to actually blow off CO2 here. Then I say steady for the repeat workloads. I always say no delay in this because it's really hard to actually get the data side by side. And then we look at heart rate and we say, okay, well, how is heart rate recovery changing in the last few intervals? Again, this is all trying to get at how is your cardiovascular system coping with the stress of the work that you're doing. Then when you're done answering all of these questions, you can go to your dashboard and you look and you look at these graphs and you say, okay, well, whatever one is the furthest over is my limiter. Is it a pulmonary limitation, cardiac limitation, or muscle limitation? As we can see here, I have a pretty significant pulmonary limitation, and that's not surprising to me because I have been doing, or that's really always been my limitation. So with a pulmonary limitation, there's a few things that I can do here. I always double check pulmonary function with spirometry testing, and I look at my data in my VO2 master or the data that comes back from my VO2 master. And one of the big signs of a pulmonary limitation is you'll see tidal volume kind of increase to a max. And then something might happen where tidal volume, which is like how deep you are actually breathing, just goes bad. It just starts going down. And then in response, your body actually has to breathe. You have to breathe more to maintain minute ventilation. And this is indicative of some level of pulmonary limitation because you're just not coordinated enough, especially at those very, very high exercise intensities. So I identify potentially a pulmonary limitation using the Moxy monitor and heart rate. Then what I do is I cross-check that with spirometry testing. So FEV1 divided by FVC, try to have that number be above 0.75, if not 0.8, because that's more ideal. And then I take that and look at the data from the VO2 master to say, oh, I actually, was moving enough air, my tidal volume maxed out, but then it actually started going down, or my respiratory frequency didn't get up to, for example, 55 breaths per minute. That's a pretty standard, like benchmark for not being able to breathe fast enough. So I cross-check it with that. And then from there, what you can do is you can actually look into doing inspiratory muscle training, and other things like that. The guys over at Breathe Way Better make an isocapnic bag and then have some interventions. I don't know if they're free or not, but I've always really liked working with them. So you could go ahead and check that out. What I like to do, because I don't have time, and this is just an excuse probably, I don't have time to add another 30-minute breathing session every day, is I do what is called a hard start interval. A hard start interval is designed to increase the amount of metabolites that are coming from your muscle and getting into your blood, which then is going to stimulate how much breathing you need to do. And by doing so, you can actually practice breathing fast and breathing deep in combination together during your interval sessions. So on the bike, and actually I do this on the run now too, for the first 30, 60, maybe 90 seconds, if I'm feeling spicy, I go out really, really hard. Again, the whole idea is that we want to stimulate as much metabolite, protons, CO2 as possible to try to stimulate our inherent breathing. And then what I do is I focus on breathing fast and breathing forceful and breathing deeply. So I those are the cues that I'm telling myself, okay, make sure you're getting enough air into your belly and then forcefully breathing it out and doing it quickly. Those have really helped me, and especially in running, because a lot of the times I get really tight and I kind of shrug my shoulders. I can tell that I'm kind of hyperventilating. I'm breathing through my chest and I'm just trying to breathe as fast as possible. But by focusing on, okay, breathe deep. And sometimes I breathe in and then I do a second inhale. So I go, and that really helps get the extra amount of air in there. And then I just breathe it out as hard as I can. And then I just repeat that. And sometimes it helps to have a little bit of music in your ears because you can start to kind of, hit it to the beat. So if you want to hit those higher breathing rates and those sort of things, it really, really helps to have, some sort of cadence or tempo or music or something along those lines, but really focus and tell yourself, breathe harder or breathe deeply, breathe hard, exhale hard, and breathe fast. And the first two are the most important: breathe deep and breathe hard. So that's how I approach a pulmonary limitation. If you identify yourself as somebody who has a cardiac limitation, the good news is that it's fairly easy to target something like this. First and foremost, you want to make sure that you have enough iron or ferritin, high ferritin levels, enough hemoglobin, those sort of things, because if you're trying to develop your cardiovascular system, specifically your oxygen transporting capacity, you might run into issues of adaptation if your iron is low. So I always recommend to people, get your blood work done, make sure your ferritin levels are high, make sure you're not, anemic and those sort of things. And then you'll have much more success with, more of these cardiovascular training protocols. So the biggest bang for your buck is going to be doing extended kind of heat training. So there's a number of studies. I believe it's out of Ben Taranestat's research lab, and what they've been doing is they have been looking at how heat training. So essentially doing your zone 2 training hot. So just under second threshold just under first threshold, not second threshold. Don't fall into that trap. Just under first threshold in a hot environment. So either you're wearing a bunch of clothes or you have the heat turned up, and then you do an RPE, so rating of perceived exertion of 5 for 1 hour, 5 days a week. And what they've shown is that if you do have adequate iron, then you should be able to, or then people who are cardiovascularly limited are able to actually increase their hemoglobin mass. This is similar to what you would expect to see if you went to altitude and you were also deficient in total hemoglobin and oxygen carrying capacity, except you don't have to pay thousands of dollars and go live up at altitude and have to deal with that and then come back from altitude and then have all your gains go away. So something that I have also kind of played around with is whenever I do zone 2 training on the bike, especially indoor biking, I almost always just make it hot. I do make sure that I drink enough liquid. However, there is some interesting science to say that part of the compensatory mechanisms and benefits of heat training is actually a slight dehydration effect. So the whole goal is to get kind of warm. Don't go over the top and get, totally toasty, because you can really screw things up. But if you are going easy enough, then it shouldn't be, that big of an issue. But that's what I would do if I had a cardiovascular limitation. I would start to do probably 3 to 5 days of, RPE of 5, warm environment, 1 hour at a time. And you have to do it for, at least 5 weeks. That's kind of the bare minimum. The longer out you do it, or the longer you do it for the longer amount of time, I think is just going to be more beneficial because you're kind of putting more strain and target on your cardiovascular system by doing hot, say zone 2. However, don't do in my opinion, the purpose of zone 2 is to recover in between your extremely hard days and be able to do your hard days even better. So don't let the heat be so much that you are lacking on your ability to do your high intensity sessions as well. And then for a muscular limitation, typically that's just seen if an individual can't get their SMO2 below, I think 50%. That's like kind of the cutoff. If you find an individual who can't do that, then then a couple of recommendations. I do kind of like repeat desaturation protocols where I ride pretty hard on the bike or really hard on the bike until I see SMO2 come down, and SMO2 will travel linear for a little while and then it'll start to flatten out. Immediately when it starts flattening out, I just do complete rest. And then and this is like, it can be go cycling at, like 30 watts, or it could be, complete rest, 0 watts. Either way works, but you need to do something along the lines of, 2 to 4 minutes of complete rest because you're going to be pretty tired. And the whole point of doing this is to actually have enough power in your legs to get that SMO2 to drop as much as possible. Now, if you're somebody who can't get SMO2 to drop, then something you can try to do is sets of air squats or lunges that will actually get SMO2 to start coming down, then get on the bike and then ride your ass off. Again, the whole point is that we're trying to stimulate oxygen utilization and really big oxygen flux within the muscle. So if you have an individual who has something like this going on, chances are they haven't done a lot of this high intensity stuff. And the good news is that they'll be able to adapt pretty quickly. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to stimulate as much mitochondrial functional change as we possibly can. Increases in mitochondrial function are going to allow you to use more oxygen within the mitochondria. So it's pretty straightforward protocol. Have that, be at least 1 or 2 times a week and replace or supplement your higher intensity sessions. So that's I didn't even go into what my, or I guess I kind of did. I went into what my results were for the my limiter. And there's a couple of questions that people were asking. So TJ.G asked, what does a limiter assessment tell you and what's considered limiting? So I hope I answered this question, in my big long explanation of what is a limiter assessment and those sort of things. But really what it's doing is it's trying to give you an idea of how to change your training session to target whatever limiter you have. So if you have a cardiovascular limitation, right, you're going to be doing your zone 2 work in a hot environment. You can also, for cardiovascularly limited individuals, you can also do slow start intervals where you're slowly building up the speed for VO2 max intervals or threshold or whatever it is you're doing. And the idea is that you want to give your cardiovascular system enough time to ramp up and make it so your cardiovascular system is kind of coming online and not taxing your muscles as fast as you possibly can. So essentially the polar opposite of what a pulmonary hard start interval would be at this point. So that's really, like what the limiter assessment tells you and what is considered limiting. We also haven't even gone over this, but zoning. So from my limiter assessment, what I do is I look at my SMO2 trace, and then I look at where changes in SMO2 are occurring. And I'll show my report in just a second, kind of walk you guys through that. But I'm able to determine my first threshold and my second threshold. And from there, I can actually determine, like my zones. The next question comes from Yannick is the name. And he asked, how do you actually determine your limiter and how do you standardize your environment to reduce confounding factors? And again, because I already knew the questions coming up, I kind of touched on this, but to actually determine your limiter, just go download that macro or that Excel with the macro file and then answer those questions. Play around with the different answers. Like, oh, well, what if I accidentally put, clear decrease compared to slight decrease? How does that change how do those change the numbers? And what we're looking for is just one limiting factor that allows us to tweak training a little bit to then hopefully become a little bit more individually and more physiologically targeted over the course of the next block before we do the next assessment, in order to say, yeah, like we're not going to just throw everything out. We're just going to tweak the training sessions here and there, and then see if after this next block, if the cardiovascular limitation maybe got a little bit more even, compared to the pulmonary limitation or a muscular limitation. You're never going to fix the limitation. It's always going to be there. There's always going to be some limitation, something that is limiting your performance. And this is just a way of us trying to target that and be more efficient with our training, as opposed to just kind of being like, well, we're in the base phase, so we got to do this, and then we're going to do a VO2 max phase, and then we're going to do a threshold phase. That's kind of, just throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping something will stick and hoping somebody's performance will get better. And in all actuality, it's like everything that I'm doing here is all based on trying to be more optimal in terms of, the time that I'm spending training and how do I better kind of serve myself. Because I don't know about you, like I do love training, but it's not the only responsibility I have throughout my day. And I have to get the most out of my training, or I want to get the most out of my training, but I also want to get the most out of my life. So those are the things that I'm kind of trying to balance. And this is why physiological testing and all the different tests that I'm doing are really important to actually figure that sort of stuff out. All right. So now let's really quickly go through the way that I determine zones based on a 3-1 assessment. And let me see which one. I think it's this one. We might have to switch it up. Yep, it is this one. So this is just a report that I got from the VO2 Master Manager, which is how I collect all my data. And as you can see, I do, 1 power output, rest a minute, 1 power output, rest a minute. I start at 60 watts, and I think I got up to 360 watts here. And the great thing about this is that you get all your data, kind of overlaid, and you can look at it all at the same time. What I like to do is I like to take the data and put it into or view it with like Training Peaks or something else along those lines, because then I can like isolate, say, for example, this light purple is the SMO2 that I actually want to look at in order to determine my zones. But for the purposes of this, what I'm looking for is, if we can zoom in on this actually. So within each of these drops, SMO2 goes down and then actually it starts coming up. And it continues to do that until this stage right here. So I think this is the 180 or 200 watt stage. So it goes down and then comes back up, and then it goes down and stays kind of flat, maybe comes up like slightly at the end. Then it goes down and stays flat, goes down and stays flat. And then eventually it goes down, flat, and then down, and then it continues to go down. And the two transition points where SMO2 goes from increasing to flat and then from flat to decreasing are where your first and second threshold are. So if we were looking at this, I would say first threshold is probably around here between these two steps. So between 180 and 200, just because I'm a little bit ego driven, I like to just round up to the next stage where I say, okay, well, the first, stage where it's actually flat, I like to use as my zone 2, just so I'm, kind of pushing a little bit in terms of zone 2. And then I like to take that stage where it does start to decrease, and I like to take really, either that stage or the stage before that as my second threshold. So for this case, it's really probably 180 is my first threshold and 280 is my second threshold. And if we go over to my summary report, then we can see, I think I actually rounded up, because my heart rate was actually pretty low at even 200 watts here. I tried to say, okay, well, what was my heart rate, or what was my power output at the same heart rate as the previous test that I did? And what I found is that from the first test that I did, my heart rate of 133 was commensurate with 210 watts, and then last test it was 133 was at like 220. Similar sort of situation where 156 watts, even though first and second threshold were actually occurring probably a little bit lower than this or similar. I used the same heart rates just to see, what was I actually getting more fit here? So for me, what I'll do is, if I'm doing zone 2 work, I'll say really anything at or below 220 or 133 beats per minute is really good, stimulus for my zone 2 sort of work. I also view zone 2 work as recovery work. So I do my hard VO2 Max sessions on Monday and Tuesday, and then Wednesday and Thursday I follow up with really quite easy zone 2 work, as easy as I need it to be, so that on Friday when I come back to do a threshold workout, I'm able to actually do well in that threshold workout. And that's been working really, really well for me. It gives me the peace of mind to say, I don't actually have to go hard every single day. And it gives me the ability to just like not be beholden to having actually to go, really, really hard every single day, or live up to the standards that I'm, like detailing from like a 3-1 test, or, my incline ramp test for my treadmill workout. So second threshold, 280, 156, and then I was able to make it up to 360 watts, heart rate of 173 for the 3-1 test. The differentials here, about 5-ish% increase in where BP1 is, given the same heart rate, 3.7% increase in second threshold, and just under 3% increase in max wattage based on the power output that I got to on the last step. So altogether, what I'm going to use this for is whenever I do, my second threshold or first threshold, second threshold, or VO2 max training, I now know that I can shift up potentially the targets that I'm actually aiming for in terms of power output and heart rate. I always use everything as a continuum. So I would say if I was doing threshold work, I would say, okay, you can, the range is, the target is 280, but the range for this is anywhere between, 260 and 320, depending on how you're feeling. And what I do is I feel out kind of the first couple of reps, and I say, okay, 280's feeling really good today, for example. So I'm going to keep this next one at 280. And then, the last two, I'm going to try to hit 300 for 3 minutes on, 1 minute off, for example. If I feel crappy, then I say, okay, well, 280 is probably not the number today. So I will bump it down to 260. I'll see how that feels. And if I'm able to maintain the 260 and not have runaway heart rate or runaway SMO2, or SMO2 just keeps going down and down and down, then I'll maintain that 260. But if heart rate starts to run away, SMO2 starts to run away, those sort of things, I'm not afraid to call it at this point. For VO2 max work, I give myself targets. I say, okay, well, you hit 400 for 5 minutes. So your target now is going to be 400 for 90 seconds, the first 90 seconds. And then I want you to relax into 350 for the next 2.5 minutes. Coming off of this Monday, it was, my legs were tired, and I was tired just in general because I had done, like my first 4 rep hill workout plus the moving of the bales of hay. And then I was trying to increase, the hard start interval from 60 seconds at 400 watts to 90 seconds at 400 watts. I got through the first 2 intervals. They were fine. But then I did the third interval, and I got through maybe I think I got through 90 seconds, and it was awful. And I felt so tired. So I was just like, okay, after this, it doesn't even matter. I'm totally exhausted. So I cut that interval short. And the moral of the story here is that that's okay. I had already put in 2 really hard intervals, probably got the majority of the adaptation that I was really aiming for. And, from there, adding more wasn't going to do too much for me. All right. So last test, because we talked about the limiter assessment, let's go over the incremental or the incline treadmill VO2 max test. This was a fun test. Let me just share the report, and then we can kind of walk through it. So my protocol for this test was to do, I started at 2 miles an hour, and every minute I increased 1 mile an hour until I got to 5 miles an hour. Then after that, I kept it at 5 miles an hour, and I increased incline every minute by 2%. And I was able to get to 5 miles an hour and 24% grade. And the reason why I kept it at 5 miles an hour is because the speed at which I am going to have to run this race that I'm going to do is 5 miles an hour if I want to hit 30 minutes. So I wanted to get a baseline of what the test actually was going to feel like, what 5 miles an hour actually felt like, and how fast or how steep I could run that and still maintain composure. I believe I got up to probably like 16 or 18 maintaining composure. But my goal is going to be 20% maintaining composure and being able to hold that for 30 minutes. So the ideal, sort of outcome here would be to hit 5 miles an hour at 20% for 30 minutes. That is going to be indicative of the average overall gain of the race, even though the race is insane. And I'll show you in just a second. But it's like up to 45% grade at some points in the beginning. There is a section that is an average. It's a 3/4 of a mile, and the average incline is 30%. So that's going to be the hardest section to maintain. But if I can somehow maintain that ability to do 5 miles an hour for 3/4 of a mile at 30%, then I'd be feeling really good. So that was the reason why I did my incremental or my incline ramp test the way I did it. What I encourage people, especially in running, is to make the ramp test as similar to the race that somebody is going to do as possible. So for example, I'm doing, uphill running. I want that test to be as similar to uphill running as possible. It doesn't make sense for me to do a VO2 max test on flat or on a 2% grade going up to 12 miles an hour. Absolutely doesn't make any sense because I'm not actually training that way, and I'm not going to be running that in the race. Somebody who's running a flat marathon, that absolutely makes sense. You want the speed. The speed matters more than the incline does. For someone who's like a trail runner, it's going to be going up and down and those sort of things, then maybe a mixture of speed and incline is a good way to think about creating this test. And the good news is that if you do have this equipment and you're doing VO2 max tests for individuals repeatedly, you can create the test in their initial test in the beginning, and then you can repeat that over time to see how they are progressing or not progressing within that kind of fitness that we're determining as specific to the work that they're going to actually be doing. So I really encourage all of you out there who have, a wide variety of runners that you test, really play around with both doing incline and speed and tailoring those things to the individual that's in front of you. I really find that it makes it much more meaningful if you say something along the lines of like, oh, well, I know that your race is going to be similar to this, therefore I made the test like this. Because then people start to feel like, oh, oh, this is individualized to me. And then they can start to say, like, for example, the next time I go and do my incline treadmill test, I'm going to try to hit 26% for a minute. I only hit 24% for a minute last time. So, there's like incentives to try to do a little bit better. So let's talk about the actual results here. And I'll share kind of two things. The first one I want to share is just what the VO2 Master Manager kind of pops out for you. And I absolutely love these reports. What they do is they give you, like your maximal metrics in terms of, speed, VO2 max, max heart rate, maximal ventilation, maximal tidal volume, maximal respiratory frequency. So I just use these numbers. Speed, because we're doing incline and other things like that, doesn't really work for us here. But from a VO2 max perspective and heart rate, I love using that, and it's consistently calculated. And then ventilatory threshold 1 and ventilatory threshold 2. These are really, kind of what we're working with in terms of determining, like our exercise intensities and on different days. So now I know that when I go out for a zone 2 or easy run, 141 in terms of heart rate, should be the target or lower. If I'm going out and doing threshold, try not to go above 164. And these numbers were determined based off of my SMO2, so via Moxie here, where so ignore kind of these first first 5 minutes of the test, because I went from walking to running around the 3 or 4 minute mark. And then from there, what we can do is we can look to see where these breakpoints in SMO2 are actually occurring at. So you see, if we drew a line down the initial purple slope of SMO2, we have a first breakpoint that's, pretty close to where I put VT1, maybe a little bit further up, but I trust, I like to be a little bit more conservative. And then the second one, we see there's probably another shift in SMO2 slope here, but we also see a change in total hemoglobin. You see total hemoglobin is starting to rise, and then it really starts to rise. And that is indicative of something, probably, CO2 or something else that's actually happening. And if we go up to the respiratory frequency and minute ventilation sort of tab, what we see is almost right where we put VT2, you start to see a decrease in tidal volume and an increase in respiratory frequency, which is again indicative of some level of limitation in terms of our pulmonary system. And that's something that I've noticed for a really long time, has been prevalent for me as a pulmonary limitation, especially when I'm running. When you're running, it's really, really easy to kind of bunch up, not breathe effectively, not have, full movement throughout, your thoracic spine and other things like that to extend your lungs as wide as they can get and bring in as much air as you possibly can. So there's that. And then if we just go to my actual report here, we can just get, we can just pull the numbers and we can see how things have changed over time. Or actually we can't, because this is the first time that I actually did it. But just to go over the numbers, my VO2 max was essentially 84. My VO2 max in liters per minute was like 6.4. And this is very similar to my cycling 5-minute VO2 max as well. So, these were done on completely different days. These were done a few days, like a week apart. So I am fairly confident, that at least the device is reading repeatable numbers. 84 is really, really high, and I totally understand that. But what I'm really looking to get out of the VO2 Master is my VO2 max and are my respiratory variables changing, and how are they changing? I can trust the fact that, it is very repeatable, because it's like 84 and 6.4, 84 and 6.4, maybe a little bit more, because I did actually weigh slightly different, from Monday all the way to Friday. So I did change those numbers ever so slightly. So that's really what I was coming away with. And then somebody also asked about determining economy with the VO2 Master. And given a 1-minute step test, you can't determine economy because there's really no stabilization in terms of VO2. However, if you really wanted to determine your economy, given your VO2 Master, what you would do is you would have longer steps. So, 4 to 5 minutes of something that is going to eventually really be sustainable, so have the ability for the individual to reach a steady state. If it's possible to reach a steady state, you would take the average of the last 2 or 3 minutes, whatever is steady enough. The average of O2, so VO2, so mils per kilogram per minute, or liters per minute, doesn't really matter which one you choose. And then you would divide that by the speed that you're running at. And then from there you can get population norms and other things like that, and compare them to what other people have, or how the individual is changing over time. And that's really how I'm going to eventually be using it. At this very moment in time, because I didn't do longer steps, I am a little hesitant to use the economy there. However, I'm thinking that if I do the same test over and over and over, then I'll be able to compare the way that VO2 is changing over the entire course of the test with how much oxygen I'm consuming based on the test that I'm doing. So more on that a little bit later. And then in terms of, sort of actionable or data-driven approaches to this, again, like my VO2 max is pretty high for both running and for cycling. However, I'm going to do one more block of VO2 max development because I've been seeing really, really good improvements in that. And then, so I am not expecting the same amount of improvement. Like I'm not expecting 10% increase in VO2 max. Again, that would be absolutely absurd, but I'm expecting a little bit more improvement. And if anything, more on the performance side of things. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to transition a little bit more towards that threshold, like more threshold workouts. So right now I do 2 VO2 Max workouts a week and 1 threshold workout. And I think what I'll end up doing is doing my VO2 Max hill workout is going to stay, but it's going to be a little bit more along the lines of changing to a threshold workout. I'm going to keep my top end VO2 Max bike workout, and then I'm going to start to extend my threshold workout that I do on Fridays. And if at some point, I start to feel a little bit better, don't need as much recovery, those sort of things, I'll start to add a little bit longer workout, maybe on Saturdays. But right now, everything that I'm doing seems to be trending in the right direction. So I don't want to change too much of that. All right. So to end off this episode, this has been a long one. I really appreciate you guys continuing to listen to this, because this is kind of just like the exercise physiologist handbook on how and where to take or what to do with your physiological testing. So it's a lot, but there's a number of different questions I want to get through, and I think we will end the episode by answering those, and then so let's start with some more of the incline treadmill VO2 Max stuff. People ask what the protocol is. So I described that it was, starting at 2 miles an hour, increasing 1 mile an hour until I got to 5 miles an hour, which is my target race pace, and then increasing 2% per minute from there. I didn't want to make it, another 3-1 test. My run, like I have a little bit of Achilles, tweak right now, and I didn't want that to get in the way, and it didn't, which was good. So it was like a 15 or 17 minute test, and that was perfect for me. I answered the question, and that was from Ariel Figueroa. Ariel Figueroa 77 and Danny for Performance both asked what the protocol was. If you guys have any more questions about protocols, DM me. Dr. G. Demera asked, how can you measure running economy with VO2 Master? Really what you're going to do is you're going to take the average oxygen consumption over the course of the different steps and divide it by the speed that the individual is running at. So it gets a little bit more complicated when you start to add incline, but that's like the general overarching trend. Gab Fortin asked, is your FTP on Zwift the same as your LT2? We're going to need about 30 to 45 more minutes to just discuss all the nuances of this. But essentially, if you do the FTP estimator, which I believe is like a 1-minute step test until failure, then and if I'm getting the protocol correct, then Zwift is trying to get at really LT2, and then they're saying that is your FTP. They're not exactly the same thing, because FTP is a performance marker, whereas LT2 is lactate threshold 2, which is a physiological marker in indicating where exercise intensity goes from sustainable to unsustainable in terms of lactate production. So they're not exactly the same, but they're used very similarly in terms of representing what training intensities to work at, especially that higher end tempo threshold style workouts. So they're not exactly the same, but they're very similar. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to estimate where exercise intensity goes from sustainable really to unsustainable. FTP is a performance marker. It takes in a lot more. Like if you're actually doing the proper FTP protocol, which is 5 minutes, like a 5-minute all out test, and then a 10 to 15 minute full rest, and then a 20-minute all out test, and then you take 95% of that 20 minutes, it's taking into account things like your VO2 max, your second threshold, your economy, other things like that. Whereas second threshold or LT2 is simply, but it's still complicated, the point where lactate starts to accumulate at a faster rate compared to what it had been earlier. So that's it's similar, but it's not the same. Robbie Seaton Todd asked, what's one specific example how you incorporated your test results into your training? So when I first started or actually, no, this is a better one. So when I do my threshold runs outside, I always make sure that I don't go over the second threshold heart rate, which I believe was 164 at this point. So I try not to go over the prescribed heart rates or prescribed powers or something along those lines. So that's one way I do it. Another way I really like to use these is just, am I progressing or not? And at what point do I start to change my training focus from VO2 max to threshold? So that will get a lot more important, like the implementation of the 164 beats per minute or the 280 watts. Once I start to go away from my VO2 max, which that's determined by the power output that I achieve either during the 5-minute test and or the 3-1 test, and then go more towards that second threshold. So then AP_BDA asks for reasons between longer and shorter steps in a protocol. It really depends on what you're trying to get out of everything. So if you are trying to look at changes in steady state, like maximal lactate steady state stuff or economy values, then you want longer steps. If your individual is training for things that are a lot longer, then learning about the stability of their physiology at different exercise intensities is really important. Whereas if you have an individual who is training for shorter races, like a VO2 max style race, like a 1500 or a 5K or a 3K in terms of running, or a 2K if you're a rower, then that's less important. And it's more important for us to measure, say, VO2 max. If you have somebody who's kind of in the middle, like me, who's doing 30 to 60 minutes, then you can kind of go either way. It really just depends on what you are truly trying to look at in terms of the, the overall outcomes of your test. So if you're really interested in the individual, breakpoints, then having a little bit longer protocols actually can kind of determine where those breakpoints truly are or not, and making them a little bit shorter in terms of like the steps. So as opposed to doing 20 watt steps, you could do 15 or 10, and then you would get more granular. Because right now, the confidence that I can say, oh, my second threshold is at 280 watts. Well, that's 280 watts plus or minus 20. So it's really 260 to 300 just because I made 20 watt jumps the entire way. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about thinking about how to make these protocols for individuals. And it really comes down to, what is the individual training for? What are the outcomes you're really interested in? And is it really necessary for me to have, say, for example, an 8-minute step versus a 6-minute step? Something I always think about is time efficiency. The less we can, if I can get the same amount of data from a 3-1 test versus a 6-1 or a 5-1 test, I'm essentially cutting, the time on the bike down by 50% if it's a 6-1 or a 3-1. So that's going to be a lot easier to keep the individual motivated to do other things like that. And I think it's really important just to keep that in mind when you are, prescribing these tests, because they can get pretty grueling, especially if you're going to require somebody to be fasted. Another reason why I don't like people to be fasted. Or if, if motivation can be a factor, for that individual. All right. Last few questions here. Protocols for testing LT1. It's really, we'll just say protocols for testing first threshold are you want to start at a power output or a speed that is definitely lower than their first threshold. You'd be amazed by how many people overestimate where somebody's first threshold is, and then they completely miss it. And then you have no idea how to, how to actually train at lower intensities. I almost always like to start my cycling threshold or my cycling incremental ramp tests at like 60 watts. For most people, minus like very, very few, very unfit or very small individuals. 60 watts is a really good place to start. And then going up 10 watts to 20 watts, depending on somebody's, fitness level and where you think they're going to get, is a really good way of figuring out where that first threshold really is. First threshold is a lot more squishy than second threshold. And what I mean by that is that it's really easy to miss, or either miss first threshold or, on a day-to-day basis have it shift because we're looking for really, really small changes in physiology. Whereas second threshold is a pretty drastic change where the individual goes from sustainable to unsustainable exercise intensity. So their breathing picks up, their SMO2 will go down, their lactate will actually go noticeably up higher. So LT1, you just have to be pretty precise with what you're measuring and how you're measuring it and start lower than you normally think. Omar 2A asks, what is the significance of measuring CO2 during a VO2 max test? CO2 gives you the ability to measure RER, respiratory exchange ratio. Respiratory exchange ratio is important because it gives us the ratio of oxygen consumed to CO2 produced. And then from there, you can get how much fat and carbohydrate you are actually oxidizing at any given point. So it gives you the opportunity of knowing, what substrates the individual is burning, essentially up until second threshold, and then you can't measure that anymore because you get excess CO2 production. So it's just a way of kind of telling this individual relies a lot on fat up until 200 watts, and then past 200 watts, they're really relying on carbohydrates, or vice versa, those sort of things. It's not necessary, as we've seen with using like the VO2 Master, for example, but it does add a little bit of extra information if you are really interested in things like substrate oxidation, for example. But you can get a lot of information from just VO2 measurements as well. Eileen Moore asked, are there any surprises for testing, and what and how will you change your programming based on your results? Yeah. So the biggest surprise that I've seen actually is from like the amount of calories I have to consume. 3,600 calories per day is actually quite a bit. And then when I go and try to actually eat that amount of calories and track it, it's still really hard because I'm a really busy individual. I literally am sitting down for a 2.5 hour podcast here, missing lunch, doing other things like that. Not because, it's like, that's just the nature of my life and my mind and my job. So it's hard for me to actually eat enough, but the realization that after I did start eating enough, my performance started to improve even more. My sleep improved more. My libido improved even more. It was pretty crazy. So that was a huge realization. And then in terms of, changing my training, there's nothing that I have seen other than seeing a pulmonary limitation time and time and time again. So I know that probably one of the best things for me in terms of addressing any sort of performance limitations that I have would be doing inspiratory muscle training, breath work, other things like that. I simply don't have time at the very moment, to put as much effort as I need to into that. But it is something that I should be doing. So, it's like we can even get results. And then, even as a physiologist, I can, tend to ignore some of them just because I have, time constraints on my life and other things like that. What I do try to do is I do try to incorporate a little bit more of that pulmonary limiter, changes to my training, in a sense from the hard start interval perspective. So Coach Isaac OP asked, what do you prefer, VO2 Max with a metabolic cart or a 5-minute test for an amateur rider? If you can get an individual into the lab to do at least one VO2 Max test on a metabolic cart, I think it's pretty eye-opening because you can get all that information, first threshold, second threshold. If they're measuring CO2, you can get RER, carb, fat oxidation, those sort of things. You can get VO2 Max. So there's a lot of information you can get from a VO2 Max test on a metabolic cart. Then what you can do in the meantime is you can do 5-minute tests every once in a while if you're interested in seeing what the individual's capability is over the course of 5 minutes. So I don't think I prefer one or the other. I think there's just situations where I would, like, any athlete I work with is, if possible, going to be required to do some level of regular
physiological testing. So it gives you so much information that it's like one of those things where if you just do a 5-minute test, you just get max power and max heart rate. And you can do stuff with that, but it's not as robust as if you go and do a VO2 max test on a metabolic cart. You can get so much information, and it can actually tell us a lot more, like a deeper story of how the individual is coping with exercise or their capability to cope with exercise, what they need to target, other things like that, compared to just, oh yeah, their 5-minute test wasn't as good as we wanted it to be, so we're going to try to make their 5-minute test better. So long story short, I think both are extremely important. And the 5-minute test can definitely be done, not in a lab. You just program that right into their, regular training or something along those lines. So Hanuman Siag, he asked, how to do lactate blood tests. So you would do something very similar to that 3-1 test that I did. And, you would have somebody run for 3 minutes at, starting at a really easy pace, increase those paces over time. You would, measure your blood lactate within 30 seconds to a minute, and then you would graph blood lactate over time. And then what you would look for is you would look for the first shift in blood lactate from kind of resting values to something that's a little bit higher. That's your first threshold. And then the second shift from, lactate levels that are rising at a certain rate to a steeper rate, that's your second lactate threshold. And then what you would do from there is you can make your zones based on your first and second lactate threshold. All right. Oh man, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this last name very well, but Ali Motighayan asked, can you tell me about fat max testing for cyclists? So what fat max testing really is it's trying to determine what somebody's maximal rate of fat oxidation is. And that's based off of, their CO2 production and O2 production at harder and harder exercise intensities. The way that fat max testing works is you do longer, lower intensity steps until you get above that fat max. And what it's trying to tell us is basically how good your mitochondria are at utilizing fat, especially at low intensities. I think it's a little, because it's so inaccessible, I think it's a little overblown because we just don't have the ability to retest somebody's fat max over and over and over and over. What I will say though, is that it is a good way, especially if somebody's an ultra endurance athlete, Ironman athlete, something along those lines, to determine if, their substrate oxidation and if they're going to be able to last at the pace that they're going for the race distance and the speed that they're expected to go. So, it's one of those things where I don't know, unless you're specifically going to be racing kind of around fat max, which is your first threshold. I don't know if it is the most necessary in order to try to determine. And then this is actually from Thomas Holtrup, follow-up, sort of question. What's the best way to find fat max without spirometry? So the only way to find fat max is to truly measure oxygen consumption, VO2 production, or oxygen consumption, CO2 production during an incremental ramp test with longer steps. And if you don't, then we are relying on surrogates of things that are related to fat max, but not actually fat max. So if we talk about lactate threshold 1, ventilatory threshold 1, Neers breakpoint 1, all of those should be pretty close to where fat max actually is, but we can't technically say it's truly measuring fat max because you're not actually measuring how much oxygen you're consuming and CO2 you're producing, which then allows us to calculate to how much fat oxidation is actually going on. So without spirometry, you can't actually measure it. However, you can get pretty close to estimating where it occurs in terms of the exercise intensity by measuring things like Neers breakpoint 1, ventilatory threshold 1, or lactate threshold 1. All right, last question. Mad Steerable asked, or just said, like I want as much data and reflections as possible. So this is actually a perfect, like way of rounding things out. I hope that all of you got something from this episode. This is a culmination of about, 10 plus years, a decade of physiological testing on both myself and hundreds of other athletes. And this is kind of just the tip of the iceberg. We didn't even get into how to make testing protocols or which, like how to change, like the step or what the purpose of the step is. We kind of touched on it, but not, like 100%. But this just should give everybody an idea of how an exercise physiologist uses physiology, repeat testing, and physiological assessment in order to make my training more optimal. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions, comment down below. If you're on YouTube, comment down below. If you're on Spotify, really, this is the sort of stuff that I love to do. I talked for, 2 hours and 20 minutes, doing this and didn't even bat an eyelash. So, if you guys do have questions, please let me know. DM me. You can always find me on Instagram at Critical02. Everywhere you get your podcast episodes. If you enjoyed this episode and if you want more, please consider going to Spotify and giving me a 5-star review. It really helps push the channel to more people and get my message that, kind of physiological testing is really important for optimizing training, optimizing fitness, and then allowing you to maximize your life and your endurance capacity. So with that, I hope you guys really enjoyed this episode. I definitely did. I hope you gained a lot from it, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.